Child Protection Week gets underway in the country. 3 child murders have already grabbed our headlines. 2 teenage girls were found hung near their school hostel in the northwest, and a 9-year-old child was killed in a botched hijacking in Durban just yesterday. Despite our sophisticated legal framework, South Africa is still marked by high levels of violence against and exploitation of our children. Divya Naidoo is the Child Protection Program Manager at Save the Children. She joins us now from our Durban studios. Good afternoon, Divya, and thank you for your time on the SABC News Desk.
Good afternoon, Keshni, and thank you for having me on.
Divya, let's get straight into it. Are we dealing with an epidemic of violence against our children in the country, or is this being alarmist right now?
We are definitely dealing with the violence, an epidemic of violence against children in our country. There's far too many children who are being hurt every day in our country. So no, we are not being alarmist about it.
We've had distressing images coming out of Chatsworth in Durban, KwaZulu-Natal today, as little Sadia Sukraj is laid to rest. But we've had similar scenes, and so frequently it's played out across the country, these violent incidences of crime against minors and women happening in communities from all walks of life, all racial backgrounds. Crime is not uniquely a South African problem, but it is the frequency and the brutality and the age of the victims that's very alarming, isn't it, Divya? Because our victims are getting younger and younger.
That is a really big problem in our country, because we find that more and more crime is happening. I think with this particular incident, when you look at this child, we're finding that there's a big outcry in the community. But we must remember that this is not an isolated incident. Violence happens against children all the time, every day, in the very places that children should be, and that is in their homes. Children are not safe in homes, children are not safe in schools, and children are definitely not safe in communities. So while this incident has happened, the child was unintentionally a victim. But every day, children are intentionally victims, where they're being hit and abused so badly by the very people who should be caring for them.
Divya, in your line of work, what are some of the gaps or weaknesses that you've picked up in the child care and protection system that perhaps is exacerbating the problem right now?
There are many gaps and weaknesses, but I'll just highlight 2 very big things. And the first one is about resources. If you think back during the 2010 World Cup, as a country, the international community believed that South Africa was not capable of being able to host such an international event of that magnitude. But we did it. We found the resources. We put in so much of resources as a country to make it happen. And that's a major gap. We don't put in the kind of resources we need to be able to make children safe. So, for example, in one study that was done in the Eastern Cape, it was found that there were hundreds and hundreds of children in the community, and there were just 2 social workers that were there to deal with them. So we don't have enough human resources to be able to address issues of violence and to be able to help children when they actually cry out for help. The second thing is, the big issue is the lack of coordination. And again, it's linked to resources, but as a society, we don't come together to talk about what are the issues and look at how. So the same people are trying to stretch themselves so much to do as much as they can. And then there's large gaps in between where children don't get enough help. So we must use the same thinking we did in 2010 for the World Cup, and we must all pull in our resources together. But government needs to look at how do we reach children in those very marginalized communities who are really struggling with the issues.
Divya, you've actually preempted my very next question, because I wanted us to talk about the inequitable access to health, education, things like social services. Now, we know and we understand that poverty doesn't necessarily mean or equate to violence, but it is true that our poorer communities, they do tend to make headlines for violent crimes against minors and are also more susceptible to violence. Can you just quickly talk us through that link between poverty, social services, unemployment and abusive behavior?
Yeah. You've hit the nail on the head. Poverty is not directly related to violence, but what it does is it places children more at risk to violence. So for example, if you look at in a poor community, you would find a situation where children are left alone or sometimes left with older siblings to take care of them. Those pose a risk for children because children then in the poorer communities do not always have proper adult supervision. Parents are not always able to afford to put a child into safe creche or some kind of facility that they can be in during the time when they're away at work or when they're going to be late home after work. And so children are placed very much at risk. So while poverty cannot become an excuse for violence to happen, but poverty does place children a lot more at risk. So those poorer communities, children are at greater risk of violence
All right, so
in the
Divya,
home, but also because children are then unsupervised and left out in the community.
Yes, so how do you suggest we begin to prioritize these vulnerable areas? Because it's crucial that we begin to shift attitudes and priorities of policymakers to improve children's services, especially for the poorest of our children. Very quickly, Divya, I'm running out of time.
Okay, I'm just going to share what Save the Children does, and I think that's because our strategy focuses specifically on we target children where they are. So target looking at safe spaces for children at early childhood care and development centers. Target extensive programming with children in schools, with educators. Save the Children is rolling out extensive work with schools to make sure that educators don't hit children, and target extensive parenting programs. The Children's Act is very clear about the need for parenting programs, and that's where government needs to start doing a lot more work with parents in their homes.
Divya Naidoo, the Child Protection Program Manager at Save the Children South Africa, joining us on the SABC News Desk this Child Protection Week.